Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all the attendees. Welcome to the IATA webinar on the implementation of CBTA for dangerous goods. Please stand by. We will soon begin the webinar at the designated time. We expect a large number of audience today, and we will let everybody join first and start in a few minutes. Thank you. Hello to everybody. And again, welcome to the IATA webinar. We will start now at the designated time. My name is Eli Mandelawi, Senior Product Manager, Regulatory Training. And we are broadcasting to you today from Geneva in Switzerland. Today is the 21st of September, 2021. And we are gathering here in this virtual webinar to provide you with information about the new approach that has been evolving for the last couple of years. This is the competency-based training and assessment, known as CBTA, for dangerous goods. You have all probably heard about it and that it's already started. However, we are still in a transition period, and you might want to expand your knowledge about the new approach and learn more information that will enable you to transition yourself and your organization properly into CBTA. We would like to thank all the attendees from all over the world that are taking part in this webinar. Wow, and we see that the number are increasing immensely. We are over 1,100 right now, but the numbers are increasing rapidly. So I hope that you will find this webinar useful. I will start with some background information. As you know, the 62nd edition of the DGR was including already the competency-based training, the CBTA, revised provisions for dangerous good training that were incorporated, the CBTA approach that will become mandatory for dangerous good training from the 1st of January 2023. IATA recognizes the challenges faced by many organizations to transform their current dangerous good training program to CBTA. The framework, while keeping up with the industry standards and compliance. To this end, included in the 63rd edition of the DGR, there is a revised Appendix H, Dangerous Good Training Guidelines, CBTA approach, that expand even more on the guidance that was included in the Appendix H in the 62nd edition. So there are quite a new information to wait for. As a solution, IATA also established the CBTA Center that will be also presented later on in this webinar, a new certification program to accredit dangerous good training that will replace eventually the ATS. Before we start, some technical information. This session is conducted under the competition law compliance. We have, as I mentioned, we have today a significant large number of attendees, and microphones have been muted. All along the session, you can submit questions during the presentations of the different speakers. Please submit your questions through the question box and send. The webinar is being recorded and you will be made available after including the PowerPoint presentation. We will explain later how to obtain that. Few more things before we start. So about the agenda. During this 1-hour webinar, you will be provided with an overview of the regulatory framework, including the roles and responsibilities under the CBTA approach to dangerous good training. Another part will be an overview of the new Appendix H of the 63rd edition of the IATA DGR, including an explanation of the components and phases for the development, implementation, and maintenance of the CBTA program. Then we'll touch on another point, which is the presentation of the IATA CBTA Center, a new certification program to support the industry in developing a competency-based dangerous good training and assessment program. And then we will end up with a session of Q&A questions from the audience side. This is a quite wide subject. We are aware about that. The session is for 1 hour, and we want to keep ourselves in focus. And the objectives for this webinar is to give you heads up for the upcoming changes, opportunity to understand the background of these changes that are related to CBTA, and allow time in advance to prepare the training program, your organization training program, and to share the available methodologies and practices to implement the training programs in the training programs, and of course all of that to keep the high quality of your training programs and the currency to the regulation. I would like to present our speakers for today. Our speakers for today are three speakers from IATA. They will have each one of them is an expert in their field of activity. I would like to present David Brennan, Assistant Director, Cargo, Safety and Standards. I would like to present Candy Chen, Manager, Dangerous Good Standard. And I would like to present Yaniv Sorani, Senior Manager, Certifications. Each one of them will deliver a part in the webinar in the next couple of minutes. I would like to hand over now to David Brennan to talk about the regulatory framework for a few slides. The floor is yours, David.
Thank you very much, Ellie, and good day, everybody. So if you go to the next slide, please, Ellie. So by way of introduction, as Ellie mentioned, competency-based training and assessment for dangerous goods has been in development for quite a number of years through a working group of the ICAO Dangerous Goods Panel. That came to culmination in September of 2019 at the 27th meeting of the Dangerous Goods Panel, where the provisions for competency-based training and assessment were agreed by the panel to replace the existing Part 1, Chapter 4 in the technical instructions with a new Chapter 4 of Part 1 for adoption into the 2021-2022 edition of the technical instructions with a 2-year transitional period. So it was recognised that states in particular, but also training providers, employers, operators, everybody involved in the development, delivery and approval of dangerous goods training needed time to adapt to the new provisions, and therefore the panel recommended a 2-year transitional period. What was developed and recommended by the panel was provided to the ICAO Air Navigation Commission. The Dangerous Goods Panel reports to the ANC, and the ANC considered what was recommended by the panel. They endorsed that. It then went to the ICAO Council, who also endorsed the provisions for adoption of competency-based training and assessment, and that moved forward to be brought into the 2021-2022 edition of the technical instructions. IATA, of course, in our dangerous goods regulations, must reflect the provisions that are in the ICAO technical instructions. So we modified subsection 1.5 in this year's edition of the dangerous goods regs to reflect what had been adopted by ICAO in the technical instructions. To support the transitional process, 1.5 from the 2020 edition was moved to the back of Appendix H, it's attachment A, to facilitate those people who were still using the old methods, the old provisions associated with dangerous goods training, and particularly, as I mentioned, regulatory authorities need time to adapt, and that just facilitates that they have both provisions available for use. Next slide, please. So if we look at what's changed in 1.5, and hopefully it's not a surprise, we're now in September, and so people should be well familiar with the provisions of subsection 1.5, but just to reinforce those changes and give a bit of background. So one of the things that was deleted was the list of employers. So the 1.5 used to say dangerous goods training must be developed or provided by or on behalf of, and then we had a list of employers effectively. And it was operators, shippers, freight forwarders, ground handling agents, and so on. And that was deleted, and it was made very clear that it is the employer that is responsible. And that's something that we have to, I think, reinforce and bear in mind. So we have a couple of new sentences there that I think are, or paragraphs that are very important, that the employer of personnel that perform functions aimed at ensuring that dangerous goods are transported in accordance with these regulations must establish and maintain a dangerous goods training program. And that's important, and that text took quite a bit of development because there was a bit of a split within the dangerous goods panel. There were some who believed that dangerous goods training should apply to all persons handling cargo, not just dangerous goods. It certainly applies to personnel employed by an operator. So an airline that does not hold an approval to carry dangerous goods as cargo must still develop and implement and deliver dangerous goods training to their relevant employees. And the view of many of the panel members was that that should also apply to entities such as freight forwarders, that whilst they say they will not handle dangerous goods, must still provide training to their personnel, because if they don't know what dangerous goods are, they may not recognise if they are offered improperly. That wasn't supported by every panel member, and what that text that you see was an attempt to cover all the bases and satisfy both sides of the argument. The other important piece was that the employer must ensure that personnel are competent to perform any function for which they are responsible prior to performing any of these functions. And this must be achieved through training and assessment commensurate with the functions for which they are responsible. So there's two key elements in there. One is that they must be competent to perform the function, and that the training and assessment has to be commensurate with the functions for which they're responsible. And I'll pick up a bit more on the commensurate in a minute. And associated with this, we developed guidance on competency-based training and assessment, which is in Appendix H. And within H, we've got task lists for well-defined job functions. And the reason for picking out the well-defined job functions is dangerous goods training is not new. It's been around since the 1980s and probably even before that in many places. And this idea that we're going to simply throw everything out and people had to start with a blank piece of paper really didn't help the industry. Dangerous goods acceptance is a well-defined job function. Wherever it's performed, anywhere in the world, people are largely doing the same task. They need the same knowledge, and they must have the same competencies. And we believe it's useful to actually spell that out for well-defined job functions. It gives people a template from which they can work. However, if somebody does multiple functions, if you've got flight crew that also do dangerous goods acceptance and load the aeroplane, and that happens with many smaller operators, then clearly their dangerous goods training has to cover all of the elements for which they are responsible. Next slide, please. So one of the big things that people, I think, have been latched onto for many, many years, and it's a bit of a crutch, or was, I should say, was Table 15A. And it was very useful, there's no doubt about that. It shows a list of topics, and it showed a list of categories. So you had the categories in the columns, starting with shippers and packers on the left and moving across freight forwarders, operators, and security screeners. But this, in many areas, was, I'll say, being misused. People were using this as a, oh, if you are this, then you must have this in your training. You must cover every one of these elements. I'll pick one, category 6. So that's dangerous goods acceptance. And there's an X in every single box, including loading information to pilot and command. And yet, if the people doing dangerous goods acceptance don't get involved in preparing the information to the pilot and command, why waste time in training them for something that they will never do? And you could focus more on the things that they really are responsible for and use the time better. However, many of the authorities, the regulators themselves, picked on this and said, oh, this is a minimum. You must cover every single one of these, even though this is only an indicative list, and the old provisions for dangerous goods said it had to be commensurate with the responsibilities. And I reinforce that. If people don't do something, they don't need to be competent. They don't need to waste time, frankly, in training them. So next slide. So the 2021 edition, this table and table 15B disappeared. And when that happened, there was a bit of a collective gasp from the room, and people said, oh, but what am I going to do? Well, we need to be looking at what people do and focus on the competencies for the functions that they're responsible for and address those, and not the things that they have no responsibility. Next slide, please. For operators, whilst we would hope that the regulators take a more flexible approach and particularly look at what the personnel do, we see the big impact as third-party training where you have external participants. And this is where it is much more difficult to look at the people's job function and understand what they do and design and build training and assessments accordingly. A third-party training provider will offer training, and they may have people come from a different range of employers who have different functions, who do different jobs, handle different dangerous goods. And this is where we believe that there is a need for the employer to get much more involved, much more engaged in understanding what their employee does or will do if it's an initial course, and engage with the training providers to ensure that that is communicated. And we recognize that the training providers for third-party training can't build a different course for every single person. It's just not practical, it's not feasible, and it's not affordable. But there does need to be some communication such that the trainer is aware of who's going to be walking in the room. They can be a little prepared and have some different exercises ready for different job functions within a course that's being delivered. And this is particularly important for the shippers, where, you know, if somebody's only shipping paints, perfumery products, things like that, then clearly their focus is on flammable liquids. And it's probably of little interest to them to talk about toxic substances or corrosives or radioactives. So there does need to be some flexibility. And there also should be a different final assessment at the conclusion of the course based on the job function. And again, we recognize that that is a little challenging, but it can certainly be focused on a assessment of a freight forwarder is different to assessment of a ground handler who is responsible for doing dangerous goods acceptance. And equally, if you have shippers preparing dangerous goods consignment, then their assessment should be very different to either the freight forwarder or the ground handler personnel. This certainly puts a bit more stress on instructors, and they need to be just a bit more flexible. They need to be made aware in advance of who's going to be sitting in the room next week when they deliver the course, a bit more flexible in adapting the content to address the competencies to be achieved, and then they need to plan for different exercises and different final assessments. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, the employer is really, I think, key in this, and they always were, but it's now made much more clear that the employer is responsible, and they are responsible for ensuring that their employees are competent. And the fact that somebody goes to a dangerous goods training course and passes, maybe they got 85%, which is a pretty good pass, that doesn't mean that they are competent to perform their job function. To start with, they got 15% wrong. What was that 15%? It may have been quite important. So the employers need to develop and implement a process that even after the employee has completed the course and they have a nice dinky certificate says they passed with distinction or whatever, that they can confirm that the employee is competent. And there's a number of different ways that the employer can achieve that, and I've put two here on the slide. One is they come to work, they pass the course, and they say, that's great, but we're going to have our experienced person work alongside you. You'll do the job. They will observe. If you have any questions, ask them, of course, but they will observe. And at the end of a period of time, a week, 2 weeks, 3 days, whatever's appropriate, the experienced employee can determine that, yes, this person is competent, and that can be recorded. And that should then form part of the training records. There can be an observation of their ability to correctly perform the required tasks. Now, for shippers, this may be that someone prepares the dangerous goods consignments, packs it, marks it, labels, prepares the documentation, whatever they're responsible for, whether it's only pieces of that or the whole thing, and maybe someone else then checks what they've done and make sure that it's been done properly. And if it isn't, then they go back over it, identify what they didn't quite get right, and then that's done until they believe that, yes, this person is competent, they're doing it properly every time, and we'll now say that they're good to go by themselves and we don't need to double check their work. Or maybe the company has a procedure, they always double check the work. So there's a number of different ways to achieve that. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. It's just setting the scene. I mean, we talk about the introduction of competency-based training and assessment. Some people see it as a revolution. I believe it's simply an evolution to look more at what we really expect. And I believe all the time we expected our employees, we want our employees to be competent. The alternative is we have incompetent employees, and that is certainly not good for business. So with that, thank you, and I will hand over to back to Ellie, who will introduce Ms. Candy Chen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dave. It seems that a lot of time and thoughts have been put and dedicated to this, to these changes and this new approach. I would like now, please, to hand over the next part to Candy Chen to speak about the new Appendix H of the IATA DGR 63rd edition. Candy, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yaniv, and I hope you see my screens because I'm presenting my own slides, so I'm not quite sure if you actually see what I'm seeing. So if Yaniv, or Ellie, if you can't see my screen, is it all good? Okay, thank you. So I'm Candy Chen, Manager of Dangerous Goods Standards at the International Air Transport Association. So David Brennan, he already set the scene for us, and this time is actually for the new Appendix 8 of the 63rd edition of the Dangerous Goods Regulations, making its debut in a public event, because we have a totally new Appendix 8 this time. And you may think that, okay, in the past, we have already have these Appendix 8 guidance documents for CBTA for so many years already, but it's really different this time. And it is a joint effort, I would say. So I also would like to take this opportunity to thank our members of our DG Training Working Group, Dangerous Goods Sport, the French DGAC, as well as the other industry partners who actually contributed to our new Appendix H guidance document. For those of you who are familiar to the ICAO guidance documents as well, you may still find some differences between the IATA one and the ICAO one. But I can assure you that they are deliberate differences because we really did look into it, and we actually understand the actual operations of our shippers, our freight forwarders and operators very well. And we adjusted some of the contents and to make sure that these contents are appropriate or relevant to these target audience. So now let's take a look at the new Appendix H. For some of you, you might already have received a copy of your book or maybe the EDGR, but for others, well, these would be some highlights on what have been changed. So as you can see here, the new Appendix H, they have got some new charts. We introduced some new diagrams, some new examples, and some new tables as well. Our end goal is really to help our readers to understand this guidance document easier because it's already painful or difficult enough just to transform the traditional training program into a new CBTA program. And other than that, we also introduced some new definitions. So as you can see here, we have got new definition for training course, training program, and these definitions can be found in Appendix A of the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations. And more specifically, because from time to time people do ask me, so what have been changed? And my simple answer is always, actually the whole document has been changed. It's a major upgrade for us, even in my personal opinion. And in terms of highlighting some significant changes, we clarified the differences between training program and training course. So as you can see here, we have got a new definition. That's the reason, but the reason of having such is that we found that people always misunderstood. They thought that the two terms are interchangeable, referring to one single thing. And what we did was really just to get rid of the categories that we used to talk about. But that's actually not true because training course is actually just one of the training events throughout the entire training program. On the other hand, training program is referring to the end-to-end process, starting from when you conduct the needs analysis up until you finish up with the evaluation of the effectiveness of the training program itself. So it's really referring to two different things. The next one is we explained that the role of designers and assessors. You couldn't quite find these two terms in the previous edition of Appendix H or the guidance document, but we know that they play a very vital role in the CBTA framework. So the designer, what they do is really to design the assessment and training plans. And the assessors, their main responsibility is really to evaluate the effectiveness of the training program at the end of it. So these persons, they would be collecting all the feedback to do all the evaluation analysis and then see how the program should be adjusted. What's next is we also spelled out how other training and assessment personnel can play a role in this CBTA framework, because in the past we only have a training course, so of course you have got an instructor. But now, as I said, a training course is really just one of the training events. So even Dave was also talking about you could have something like on-job training or job shadowing. You can have more experienced staff looking after the green staff or maybe less experienced employees to give them guidance, to train them and to assist them. So they could also act as a role of a training and assessment personnel. We also redefined the competency factors. So if you are familiar to the previous edition, you will find that we used to have 4 competency factors, but now we are down to 3, but nothing less. We just think that the 3 is already enough, and I will give you a bit more explanation about this. And also in terms of the levels of proficiency, We have 4 of them. We are still keeping 4 of them. It's just that we refined the definition of the 4 of them. Lastly, we also refined the task list that you can find for the well-established functions. So Dave was saying that we have got some well-established functions in Appendix 8.6, and under there, we have got some task lists listing out the activities or the tasks that each are related to the different functions. So we are keeping that, but we noticed that some of the tasks, they are actually irrelevant to the particular functions. So we also removed the irrelevant ones, but we make sure that the ones that are related, they remain there. So this is the key, is the competency factors, because the whole thing about competency-based training and assessment, the essence of it is really to enable the personnel to become competent to perform their assigned functions. So what are these competency factors? It's actually very simple. You may think that it's a big thing in CBTA, but we are actually using it or doing that in our everyday life. If you're a hiring manager, you would know it very well because you want to fill a position. So the position is really the function that you're looking at. So now you shortlist your candidates, you identify whether the candidates will have the competence to fulfill the job or not. So this is really the process that we are talking about in terms of CBTA on competency factors. So these are the main things. It's the knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Knowledge is really the specific, basic information that one should need. So you are assigned with a job. You would need some kind of information to do your job. So that's the knowledge that you require. But even after you get the knowledge, you still need to know how to make use of the knowledge, and that becomes the skill sets that you need. So it is the ability to perform the action. Attitudes, it's really vague, I would say, and it's intangible. Like in here, it says it's the internal mental state of the person. It is really down to the commitment and engagement of the individual. But we all know that whatever job that you do, you should be doing it with your heart. So it's really that kind of attitudes that this one is referring to. So altogether, these KSA, knowledge, skills, attitudes, they are the competency factors. And in my previous slide, I mentioned that we refined these competency factors. We trimmed it down from 4 to 3. Initially, the 4th one, it was the experience, but we further looked into it this year, and we believe that experience is absolutely important. That's with no doubt. But it may not be part of the core competency factors. It may be better used if a company, usually like in the past, we have got initial course or recurrent training course, then now you can have an initial program or recurrent training program. So in the recurrent training program setting, that it may be the chance that you look into the experience of your target audience, of your trainees, of your employees. You know that they have already got some sort of experience. You can take that into consideration and refine your training content a little bit so as to be adjusted to be relevant to them. So that's why we took out these so-called competency factor of experience, but we still keep these elements in our guidance document. So what's next is the components of what you are getting. So if you look at our Appendix X guidance document, you will find that we break down the whole process into 5 phases. And in each of the 5 phases, you will get 5 components. And these are the essential ones that you should have. It will be the training specification, the assessment plan, training plan, assessment materials, training materials. Then, of course, you have to deliver the training, no matter if it's a course or not a course. And lastly is the program report. But you have to bear in mind that we are saying that it's a program report, it's not a course report, because the 5 phases, it would involve the last one, which is to evaluate the effectiveness of the training program. So it's not just the effectiveness of a training course, it's all the training events and whether the task lists are relevant or not. So these would be the program report instead of the course report. And now we look into what these different phases involve. The first one here is phase one. It's to analyze the needs, because if you don't know what you need, you just don't have the program or content at all. So you would have to look into what functions that your company would have. Usually these tasks that analyzing the training needs will be done by the employer, because they know the best on what procedures that they have, on what functions that they have, and what activities the functions would involve. So they should draft up the task list and sometimes a subtask list. And then you also consolidate all different documents, including, of course, the international regulations, but also you have to remember that you need to take into account the local regulations. Your local state regulations are equally important. And lastly, it's the company manuals. So you have got the SOP, because you may have some specific requirements, like let's say for operators, they usually have aircraft limit on dry ice loading limitations. So these would be the things that you have to include. So you pull all the documents together, and now you review them and you identify the requirements. So what are these? What will be the staff need to be trained? And you also need to identify the competency factors, which are involving the KSA knowledge, skills, and attitudes that I talked about. So you need to identify what kind of knowledge, what level of skill sets, the level of attitudes that the staff need to have. And now you form your training specification. That is the first component of this entire process of phase one. After you get the training specification, you're ready for phase two. And in phase two, you actually work backward. You may think that we are a bit strange, because we always talk about assessment plan and then training plan, but you may think that it's not in a sensible order, because usually you have the training first and then you have the assessment, right? But it's different here, because you should set the goal first and then you work backward. So your ultimate goal would be your standards, your final competency standards. And then you look at what kind of assessment plan that you need to have so as to achieve there for your final competency goal. And then in this assessment plan, you should also include the assessment tools, the assessment list. So you will think about what kind of assessment I need to have. It can be practical exercises, it can be examinations, and it can be some other simulations. And it also can be a mix of each of them. And then you work on your training plan. The training plan, now then you look into what kind of training events that you should include. How are you going to structure them? Should the staff be doing a classroom training first, or an e-learning course first? Or maybe after the classroom training, then you do a little bit of simulation afterwards. So it's really a mix and match that you will like in your training plan, but definitely you will have to have a structure of it. You should have multiple events of that, and you should have the schedule as well. So now you're ready and you have got your assessment plan and training plan for phase three. Phase three is, to me, is easy, because all that I have to tell you is really to develop the meat, because now you have already got the backbone of your training and assessment plan. You just need to have the meat to fill or everything else, to make sure that the framework is filled up with whatever materials that you need. It is really down to the course materials, the study notes, or the actual exercises and things like that. So for me, it's easy for me to say. But for you, it's really, that is the core content of the entire training program that you should have. So like I said, you also need the examinations and assessments. So it can be in the form of a test paper, practical test papers. Sometimes it can be in the form of presentation, like just asking a person to explain or describe. And some of them, it can also be on-job training. So you ask the person to do a task and then you observe. But of course, some of these examples that I mentioned, they can't be used as standalone, as a standalone tool. You have to have a mix of it. So you can't just say, okay, I send this staff to do on-job training, and then after that, the person is done. He or she is qualified for accepting dangerous goods. It doesn't work like that. it is more complicated. It needs some more sensors to blend everything together to make sure that everything is complete and the person is competent. So with the training and assessment materials, and now you can move on to the phase 4. Phase 4, now you have the materials, you have the facilities and the equipment. Then of course, what's left is your instructor. So you have got the instructor, qualified the instructor to deliver the course, and then these are easy because we have been doing it for so many years already. But there are also other training events, like I said, you can have on-job training, you can have experienced staff to monitor your other green staff or just graduated staff. So you can have other training and assessment personnel as well. And lastly, it would be the phase 5 of evaluating the training program. That is a key, in fact, which I will also reveal a little more on this. But what I want to say is, after all this process, what you're supposed to get is a competent workforce. So this is the ultimate goal that we want to achieve through this new CBTA framework. And now we can look at the key players and the roles. So like what Dave said, or what I said previously, they are very important. They are actually the main actor of the entire play here. They do the analysis, they analyze the training needs. And for some employers, they may think that, okay, I don't actually have a training team here. We only hire a third-party company. We outsource the training function to another parties. But it doesn't mean that the employer does not have the responsibility. They still have to make sure that their staff has the capability and competence for performing the functions that they are assigned to. So they can't just do like, okay, well, I'm done. I have already assigned the task to another person for taking care of the training program. It's not my business. As long as my staff have already completed the program, they come back, they're fine for doing their job. It doesn't work like that. Employer always has their responsibilities. The next one is the designer. So I introduced the designer in the very first line. They are the ones who are responsible for planning. They plan for the assessment, they plan for the training, so they establish the framework or the backbone of the entire training program. Then next you have got the trainer. Trainer, of course, is to deliver, but remember that the trainer is not just about the instructor. It is also about the other non-instructor type, training and assessment personnel, which can actually be already the ones who are doing the job today. Lastly, of course, you have the employee, they participate. But remember that they don't actually just participate in the training course, in the training program. They also participate in the sense that they provide feedback. They have to provide feedback on how the training is doing well for them or not. So in terms of the effectiveness of the training program, how they think about it. Lastly is the assessor. So the assessor, like I said, it's important. They play a vital role. They are not just evaluating by collecting the feedback. They should be doing a lot more investigation work. So setting an example for a shippers, the assessor can be looking at how many previous shipments were rejected or delayed because of the incorrect decoration or incorrect packaging, marking, and so forth. So these would be the ones that the assessor can look into, or like operators, the assessor can also check how many shipments were actually accepted incorrectly, instead of just looking at what have been rejected, whether the ones rejected are incorrectly or correctly done or not. So the assessor, they have a lot to do. They actually a kind of investigator. They look into the details, they evaluate the effectiveness, and then they will analyze and then adjust the training program. So like I said, a lot of work, but it's well worth it. So to finish, these are just the benefits of the CBTA compared to the traditional training program. They're more flexible, just like what Dave was saying. For some people, currently with the categorized training, they just look at the table and think, okay, that is what the minimum needs to be, but that's not true. But then with CBTA, then it's clearer that, okay, that's really not true, because we can look at what people really do, what their functions and activities are, and then design the training program based on their needs. And you also have more interaction with your trainees or your instructor or even other parties as well, because you constantly collect the feedback. You collect the feedback in terms of the effectiveness of the training, how they think about the training program, and also how the trainers think about the employees or trainees, that what else they need to improve. So it's a lot of engagement going on here. And with the assessor, the role of them is to look at what went wrong, what can be improved. So you put more focus on the weaknesses. So compared to the traditional training, I can only say it's better, but of course you would think that because I'm selling it. Well, I'm not selling it because it's in the regulations. But what I want to say here is that I understand that transforming from traditional training is really difficult into competency-based training. It does take time, and I totally agree with that. Sometimes some players, some industry partners, they ask me, so how granular that I have to get to, how fine it should be. Well, I would say, well, you really have to take into consideration and think that it has to be narrow enough, but also reasonably wide enough. So you wouldn't be thinking that, okay, these 3 staff is not doing these tasks, and that's why I should have a training program that exclude that particular task just for these 3 staff. You don't need to go down into details like that. So it has to be fine, but really not that granularity that you should look at. So it's a lot of work, and it's already in our day-to-day life. I always like using the metaphor of driving, but one time one guy that I know, he came to me and said, I don't quite agree with you, but it's really up to you. But the thing is, if you think about it, why is it not important for someone who prepares a dangerous goods shipment and make sure that it complies with the regulations and put on board of an aircraft with 200-300 staff and passengers altogether being safe, compared to having a maniac driver on the road, is equally just as hazardous as it would have been with a dangerous goods shipments. So with that, the new Appendix H, it will be available on our website. So this is the link that you can download the new Appendix H, but I would have to remind you that it's not ready there yet. We expect that to be available in the next 2 weeks or so. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Candy. We appreciate this important new updates on CBTA and particularly on Appendix H. We would like to move on now to Mr. Yaniv Sorani. When we look at potential solutions to support the industry in the implementation, it is a time to go to the next part, that overview the CBTA Center program. Could
you see my screen?
Please, could you take over the next part and provide up with more information about the solution and how it can support the evolution of the CBTA?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So let me start first by saying that thank you for the opportunity to present the CBTA Center, which is the global accreditation body on certifying organization for dangerous goods training under competency-based training approach. We all realized during the presentation that Dave and Candy delivered that there is a big change. There is a big change from moving from what we call traditional training into a CBTA approach that require a lot of efforts and resources, I would say, but a lot of change in mindsets in the way that today we train, coach, or mentors employees or learners. And this is where we realize that there is a need to support the industry. We provide them with the right solutions and services to overcome this challenge. So the transition period allows aviation stakeholders, and whether these are regulators, employers, or training providers, or even instructors, to progressively migrate the respective training program into CBTA approach. We at IATA looks also on our ATS program. And as part of our thorough review of the ATS program, to include the provisions of CBTA approach, we realized that the industry are facing many challenges in order to transform their current dangerous good training program into the CBTA framework, and in order for them to keep up to with the regulatory standards requirements. So from our side, from IATA side, it's our responsibility, and we must to ensure that we continue to compliance with the new regulations, that we maintain a reliable network of schools that can provide the industry with dangerous good trainings according to the standards. And in response, we establish the CBTA Center. The aim of the CBTA Center is first and foremost to support the industry. To support the industry, including airlines, civil aviation authorities, training organization, to help them to develop the right capacity and the right resources to transition into competency-based trainings for dangerous good. It's equally important for us to address the industry concerns, and as I said, many of them are very concerned on how they can meet the 2020 deadline, the end of 2020 deadlines. And then at the end, to establish and maintain and monitor a globally recognized accreditation program for competency-based training and assessment in a worldwide basis and in a cost-effective manner, which is very, very important in our industry. And at the end, to enable operators and civil aviation authority to have a program that they can rely on, something that they can rely on and recognize as alternatives to their own authorization program or endorsement program. And at the end, to support the industry to develop high quality trainings and effective training that will improve the competency of the workforce in our industry. And by using this certification program to raise the bar in our industry and to give more visibility for organizations that are meeting the standards. So overall, what we identified is the need to have 3 types of accreditation program. And this certification program consists certification that focus on employers and those organizations that need to implement competency-based training and assessment within their organization, on whether these are airlines, handling agents, freight forwarders, and in some extent even shippers that provide employees with competency-based training. So to have a program that can enable them at the end of the process to accredited that the training programs that they give to their employees is meeting the standards. However, providing training to employees is very important, but we all know that the industry very heavily rely on third-party providers. And third-party providers also have an important role in continuing to provide trainings in our industry. And here we identified 2 types of certification that will support the industry in meeting these standards. The CBTA providers that will accredited training organization, on whether these are schools or other institutions, to provide accredited, well-defined job functions courses as listed in Appendix H of the Dangerous Good Manuals. And finally, we are all talking about the need for the employers to be in a position to assess the training needs, to design the training and assessment plan, to develop the content, to know how to check and evaluate the effectiveness of the trainings. And this is where it's create a need to have a network of organizations that can support the industry not only with providing them with a well-defined training courses, but with providing them with wide range of development solutions to help organizations to implement dangerous good trainings. So the CBTA Center program recognizes organization train assessment process. The applicants must submit an application and they must go through an assessment process that include 3 phases. And this assessment process, this certification process will be delivered by an IATA assessor that will work in very close cooperation with the training organization to conclude the accreditation process. These phases, as you can see, are self-assessment, assessment, and validation. The self-assessment is typically a phase that takes between 2 to 3 weeks, whereby we provide the companies with an assessment checklist in order for them to benchmark our requirements compared to their training programs and training courses, and at the end to provide us with reference document to justify their answer. This is where we start from our side, the phase 2 of the process. And in phase 2, we conduct a multi-step approach of desktop review, whereby the assessor will review the checklist, your answers, and your evidence document, but we will also schedule between 2 to 5 days of assessment, whereby the assessor will go into depths of details of your program with the intention to help you identify gaps in your program, but also help you to identify the opportunities for improvements so that at the end you will meet the requirements of the program. At the end of the assessment, the assessor will produce reports with the findings and opportunities for improvements. And this is where you will be in the driving seats in addressing those findings, or whether those will be major findings or minor findings that you will have to address. And once you address those findings, we will schedule the final phase in the process, which is the validation phase, that we will use to conclude the accreditation process and verify the implementation of the findings. So IATA strives to achieve standardization and uniformity in the scope and in depth of the assessment that we conduct. Because of that, our program standards are based obviously first and foremost on IATA Dangerous Good Regulation, on the Appendix H that include all guidelines for implementation of CBTA, but also we looked on ICAO technical instructions and the requirements in order to make sure that we are covering everything. And as you know, IATA Dangerous Good Manual always go much more beyond what is in ICAO. And on top of it, we of course added some common sense of standards and best practices for trainings and developments. So the assessment criteria of this program assume 3 parts of relationship between one or more authorities, and the standards that use and their application by the training units. So for example, the training organization needs to have an established management system in place in order to cover all aspects of the training. So government frameworks, for example, is very important, and training organization need to have a governance framework in place that define the policy, the standards of the trainings, the procedures related to the trainings, and all of this has to cover the following aspects such as instructional analysis, design, development, and delivery of the training's contents, the training and assessment process, and many other things that related to the program. So that at the end, the CBTA Center will ensure that all organizations are assessed in a consistent and objective manner by using a standardized assessment checklist and criteria that have been developed to guide the assessor and the organization through the process. So as you can see, the assessment checklist is the backbone of this program, and the current assessment checklist is based on the training provisions of the 62 edition, and very shortly this assessment checklist will be updated to reflect the latest changes of the Appendix H of the 63 edition, so that we will continuously update the assessment checklist in order to make sure that it always reflects the latest standards of the program. At the end of the process, the organization will achieve the certification. But this is where the all work starts, because achieving certification is very good, but what we are trying to focus is on leveraging learning and quality performance improvement. So continuous improvements is very important. And as part of the certification requirements, we will make sure that we provide an update refresher trainings for all dangerous good instructors, but also for all instructional designers. These provisions of training will become a compulsory requirement for every instructor as part of the CBTA Center to complete these trainings and pass the exam on a yearly basis. Obviously, we will continue to conduct spot checks in order to ensure continuous improvements, and we will conduct reassessment every 24 months to ensure that the organization remains in compliance with the latest dangerous good regulation. At the end of that process, of course, there will be a recertification every 24 months in order to certify the organization again. Finally, organization that will achieve this certification will be able to provide a competency-based training and assessment to their learners, and to provide them at the end with qualification with the co-branded IATA certificates. And under the CBTA Center, organization will be able to provide a Secure Digitals Award. Secure Digitals Award is IATA certification that we will be able to verify, any students or any employers will be able to verify in a global IATA registry. It is secured by a blockchain technologies, and it is guaranteed that the integrity of your certification for life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eliv. We are a bit behind with the time, but we will still pick up questions, several questions. You can keep the next slide. Okay, so dear attendees, we've received many questions since we have started the session, and with this limited time in the Q&A session, we will do the best, to pick up the questions that are targeting the similar topics, and we'll address them to the individual from our team. We apologize if we couldn't reach your questions, but we will take it offline if necessary. Okay, now a general question that is coming. I see. Maybe over to you, Dave. Do you foresee an extension of the transition period beyond 2022? Dave, over to you, if possible.
Thanks very much, Ellie. I've heard nothing. There's certainly not been any discussion at the ICAO Dangerous Goods panel about extending beyond the end of December 2022 to allow the old program to continue. However, at the end of the day, it is really up to the regulatory authorities in each state. Whilst the ICAO technical instructions have changed, if a state doesn't modify their regulations, if indeed they need to modify their regulations, that's really the prerogative of the state. And there's really not a lot, certainly nothing that IATA can do about that. Now, I haven't seen all of the working papers for the 28th meeting of the ICAO Dangerous Goods panel, which is scheduled for November of this year. So there could well be something raised by a panel member or a state, not necessarily a panel member, on competency-based training and assessment. But as I say, I've seen nothing, but it really is up to each state to identify what they need to do within their national regulations to either adopt or move to competency-based training assessment, or to facilitate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. We'll pick another question here. I think that's for you, Candy. Is there any platform to share feedback, input, questions regarding Appendix H from industry implementation experience that is coming from our partners, colleagues in the industry?
Thank you, Ellie. And we do welcome any feedback or contributions that you have for us. And if you go to the website that I was talking about, the www.iata.org Dangerous Goods, then you will see that we do actually have a link that you can send emails to us. So you can always send in the feedback on either the Appendix H, the guidance, the implementation, any parts of the DGR to us through the email. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, Candy. Now let's see another one. I think, yeah, I think this is a repeating. I think it's coming from number of attendees. I guess CAA. We are pleased to see that this initiative, and this will be definitely overcome the challenges that CAA are facing in improving training organizations under CBTA framework. Will you be willing to share more on the program policy and requirement for our review and consideration? I think this is for you, Yaniv.
Thank you, Eli. Happy to answer. It seems that this question is coming from Civil Aviation Authority. Definitely, I mean, as part of the developments of Appendix H and as part of the development of the CBTA Center program, we cooperate with Civil Aviation Authority. Our intention is to develop something that at the end the industry will recognize and will rely on. So by all means, we will approach different Civil Aviation Authority in the coming weeks with the intention to share with them more practical information on the CBTA Center and make sure that we are addressing any of their concerns so that at the end this CBTA Center will serve also the Civil Aviation Authority, or at least those that will be willing to recognize those programs as alternatives to their approval process.
Thank you very much, Yaniv. Just quickly, I see here questions which is in the context of ATS, so I'll take that. Will the ATS program continue beyond the transition time of 2022? In the same context, it's about the reaccreditation process of the ATS for 2022. So beyond 2022, the ATS program will discontinue. And the plan is to be replaced by the new certification program of the CBTA Center. About the reaccreditation in this transition time until the end of 2022, so that remained the same for the whole network of the ATS. So if this is the period of reaccreditation, it remains the same unchanged as done in previous years. I think we're beyond now, a few minutes beyond the time, so we'll make the closing. And we'd like to give you an indication about what's next after this webinar. So there will be a post-webinar survey. We would appreciate 2 minutes of your time to answer a short survey about the training needs, your training needs. And you can watch and share the webinar, the recording of the webinar together with the slide deck, and access to other resources will be shared at the end of this survey. So we appreciate your attendance in this survey. For more information, please visit our web pages, the Dangerous Goods page and the CBTA Center page. They will be, of course, provided with those information that will be available to you. We will now conclude the webinar on CBTA that comes to an end. We would like to thank each one of you that attended the webinar and hope that you will find this information that was brought to you useful. Have a good rest of the day or evening, wherever you are located. Thank you very much from the IATA team.